The most revealing thing in a crisis is often not the explosion. It is the price that comes after the explosion. That is where I think people need to look now. Because if you only watch troop movements, missile clips, threats, and speeches, you may come away believing this is still a familiar war story. A stronger military piles on more force. A weaker state tries to resist. Somebody escalates, somebody blinks. Eventually the balance settles, but that is not the deepest pattern here. The deeper pattern is that this war is becoming financially, politically, and psychologically harder for the United States to sustain, even before it finds a clear path to success. That is why I want to start with Hormuz. Not because Hormuz is the only piece of the story, but because it is the clearest window into the kind of conflict this has become. People keep asking, is the strait open or closed? I think that is already the wrong question. The more important question is this: open for whom, under what conditions, and at what price? That is a much more serious question. You immediately see why the situation has become so dangerous for Washington. The source material points towards something very important. Iran is not simply trying to freeze all movement. It is turning movement itself into leverage. Iranian exports keep flowing. Oman seems to have secured accommodation. Russia benefits from the wider dislocation. Insurers return selectively when risk is politically managed. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq see sharp drops. That is not just disruption. That is a pricing system emerging under wartime conditions. Call it a tax, call it a transit waiver regime, call it selective permission. The exact label is less important than the logic. A strategic choke point is no longer governed by the old assumption of neutral openness. It is starting to operate under a new assumption that access depends on political terms, risk bargains, and accommodation with the actor generating uncertainty. That is an extraordinary shift. Why? Because once movement becomes conditional, the war stops being only a military contest. It becomes a contest over who can define the price of normality. And when I look at this story, I see Iran trying to do exactly that. It is saying if you want calm, you do not get it for free anymore. If you want passage, insurance, lower risk, and commercial continuity, those things now come with political conditions. That matters because the American-led order in the Gulf was built on the opposite promise. The old promise was that Washington, however flawed, could guarantee a baseline environment where trade flowed, oil moved, and regional partners did not have to negotiate the rules of maritime access with the very state they were trying to contain. Now that assumption is under stress. And here's the critical point. The United States may still have overwhelming firepower, but firepower does not automatically cancel a pricing regime. You can bomb launch sites. You can move troops. You can threaten islands. You can tell the market the operation is under control. But can you immediately restore the old confidence structure? Can you make insurers forget new political risk? Can you make traders act as if selective passage is not real? Can you make Gulf rulers stop asking whether accommodation might be safer than alignment? Can you make the domestic American public support a long war to solve these problems? That is where the difficulty lives. The problem is no longer just kinetic, it is systemic. It is about whether the cost of maintaining rule order is now rising faster than Washington can politically absorb. This is where the 50,000 troop headline becomes revealing. People hear a number like that and instinctively think strength. I hear something more complicated, I hear cost, I hear preparation for a harder road than expected. I hear an administration that is no longer dealing with the quick, managed episode it may once have imagined. Because if the path were simple, the messages coming out of Washington would be more coherent. Instead, we get oscillation. The war is nearly over. The strait is not important. The strait must be reopened. There may be more escalation. The objectives are already achieved. This is not the language of a system at ease with its own position. This is the language of a system trying to improvise around a reality it does not fully control. And then the domestic numbers make everything worse. A majority already says the attacks have gone too far. That is a striking fact. It means the war begins not with a reservoir of permission, but with a deficit of trust. That is a terrible place to launch deeper commitments from. because every additional escalation now carries not just operational risk, but political insolvency risk. It raises the chance that Washington will keep spending more, explaining more, contradicting itself more, and still end up with less public support and less strategic clarity than before. In finance, sometimes a position does not fail all at once. It becomes harder to roll, harder to justify, harder to refinance, harder to stabilize. That is what this conflict is starting to look like politically. The administration keeps trying to roll the position forward with messaging, bravado, and selective optimism. But the underlying liabilities are growing. Hormuz remains unstable, the Gulf remains frightened. Congress remains unconvinced. The public remains skeptical. Iran remains unbroken. The demand list Iran reportedly floated makes sense in this context. Not because the list is likely to be accepted in full, but because it reveals how Iran sees the balance of pressure. Close U.S. bases in the Gulf. Guarantee no more attacks. End Israeli strikes on Hezbollah. Lift sanctions. Pay war reparations. Accept no missile restrictions. Those are not the demands of a side acting like it is cornered into immediate surrender. Those are the demands of a side that believes time, disruption, and rising costs are working against its enemy more than against itself. And that belief changes everything. Because once Tehran thinks the Americans need a way out more urgently than Iran needs a compromise, then the war ceases to be about who can make the bigger threat. It becomes about who can absorb more disorder. That is the logic Washington is now running into. The United States can still produce enormous force, but can it sustain disorder politically? Can it explain a widening Gulf crisis, unstable energy flows, weak public support, congressional doubts, and a rising price of normality all at once? That is a much harder question, and it gets harder still when you look at the wider regional incentives. Iran's warning to Gulf states is not only about retaliation, it is about forcing a choice. If you help the Americans attack from your territory, you inherit the war. If you keep distance, you may preserve room to hedge. That is the logic Iran wants inside every Gulf palace right now. Once that logic takes hold, the old architecture begins to crack because American power in the region has always relied on more than ships and aircraft. It has relied on a habit of cooperation, a belief that the umbrella still works, a belief that partnership with Washington remains the safest long-term bet. Iran is now trying to price that belief downward, not by matching America symmetrically, but by making every American move generate new secondary costs. That is what makes this such a dangerous phase. A strong power can survive direct resistance. What strong powers often struggle with is cumulative contradiction. Troops increase, but control does not. Threats increase, but confidence does not. Talks are advertised, but no real settlement appears. More force is prepared. But fewer people believe in the path. That is how wars become politically bankrupt before they become militarily finished. And that is why I think the real story here is larger than one warning or one troop count. We may be watching the beginning of a situation in which the United States still has superior destructive capacity, but no longer has a cheap way to restore the old regional order. That is a very different kind of crisis. It is not just a war of bombs. It is a war of insurance, pricing, legitimacy, access, and endurance. A war in which every day of uncertainty becomes part of the weapon. A war in which even temporary passage through Hormuz can still signal strategic failure if that passage now exists only through accommodation with the side America was supposed to be isolating. That is the humiliation built into this structure. Not that Washington is powerless. It is not powerless. But that Washington may be discovering that power alone is no longer enough to guarantee the normality it once promised the region. And once that realization spreads, the consequences go well beyond this one conflict. Allies hedge more aggressively, markets price risk differently. Adversaries study the gap between force and control. The region starts learning that the old manager cannot always restore the old order on command. That is why I think this war is becoming a kind of political bankruptcy case for the United States, not an immediate collapse. Something more corrosive a slow revelation that the liabilities are larger than the story, that the costs are compounding faster than the solutions, and that the system may keep paying more simply to avoid admitting how much has already changed. That is the kind of war that looks manageable right up until the moment everyone realizes it has already rewritten the rules. And if Washington does not understand that quickly, then every new deployment may simply purchase a little more time at a much higher price. That is not strategy, that is delay. And delay is a very expensive substitute for control.